If you are a Christian who enjoys podcasts, there's a pretty good chance you've listened to or at least heard of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Hosted by Mike Cosper and produced by Christianity Today, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill tells the story of Mars Hill Church, from its humble beginnings in 1996 through its meteoric rise onto the world stage in the early 2000s, and ultimately detailing its shocking collapse in 2014. The podcast primarily focuses on Mark Driscoll, the senior pastor of Mars Hill Church. In September of 2014, an investigation conducted by the Board of Elders found Driscoll guilty of patterns of persistent sinful behavior, including bullying, arrogance, being quick-tempered, and domineering. The elders drafted a restoration plan for Pastor Mark, which he ultimately rejected. Mark Driscoll resigned as pastor of Mars Hill Church on October 14th of 2014. Unable to weather the controversy, Mars Hill Church held its final service just 2.5 months later on December 28th of 2014. The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill chronicles this story in pretty vivid detail. And I have to say that Mike Cosper's storytelling, although at times felt a little disjointed and meandering, overall, I found it quite compelling and engaging. I often found myself on the edge of my seat, anxious about what would happen next in the story. And the podcast as a whole, from the pacing of the story to the music that was used, had this kind of true crime podcast feel to it. It's no wonder The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill was one of the largest Christian podcasts of 2021. But in my opinion, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, although an important story to tell and a very well-produced podcast, has some concerns that should not be overlooked. So whether you've already listened to the podcast or you're considering checking it out, here are 3 cautions I would advise you to heed as you listen. Caution number 1, this is a one-sided story. Now, I want to make perfectly clear just right out of the gate that this is not a defense of Mark Driscoll. I am not in any way trying to excuse his behavior. I think, in my opinion, the evidence is pretty clear that Driscoll is a broken human being that has hurt a lot of people. With that being said, the story that Mike Cosper tells is almost entirely against Mark Driscoll. In fact, from what I remember, there is no one interviewed in the entire podcast that takes a defense for Mark Driscoll. And to be as fair as possible, Mike Cosper claims to have reached out to Mark Driscoll multiple times for comment and never got a response. It's possible that Mike worked diligently to find someone that would take Mark's side to no avail. And one can argue that the reason for that is that there is no one on Mark's side, or that even Mark doesn't have a side. But that's exactly what gives me pause. Because to claim that someone is so in the wrong that there is only one side of the story to be told is a rather bold claim to make and throws up some major red flags. Mike Cosper characterizes The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill as investigative journalism. But when you only present voices from one side of the investigation, you inevitably get biased journalism. This podcast, in my opinion, is not unbiased investigative journalism like Mike Cosper would want you to believe. What this podcast is a deep dive look into the story of Mars Hill from the exclusive perspective of Mark's victims. And although that is an important story to tell, it's also an important distinction to make. And I really wish Mike would have been honest about the nature of the story he was telling. As you listen to this podcast, I think it would be helpful to remember that there's always 2 sides to every story. And this podcast really only presents one side. Caution number 2, there is very little gospel focus. Mike Cosper frames this podcast as the story of the rise and fall of Mars Hill, a story about power, fame, and spiritual trauma. But he goes on to say it's also the story about the mystery of God working in broken places. There are glimpses of the gospel peppered throughout the podcast, There are fragmented stories of God working in broken places. And there is a greater focus on the gospel in the final episode. But despite that, in my opinion, there's a lot of focus on Mark and very little focus on Christ. To be fair, one could argue that that's not really what this podcast is about. This podcast is a documentary, not a sermon. But with how much emphasis there was on what Mike Cosper considers the folly of Driscoll's theology, I was surprised to find there was no scriptural alternative ever offered. With how much lament there was, and rightfully so, on the fallout of Driscoll's version of the gospel, very little comfort was given with the true good news of Jesus. My ultimate concern is that people will walk away from this podcast with an ungodly disdain for Mark and a bitter distaste for the church at large, rather than walking away having tasted and seen that the Lord is good. Christianity Today, who again produced this podcast, their mission statement is to strengthen the church by richly communicating the breadth of the true, good, and beautiful gospel. This may be a little harsh, but in my opinion, they failed their mission with this podcast. Caution number 3, guard your heart. Shortly after I started listening to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I went over to Mark Driscoll's Instagram account out of morbid curiosity. I wanted to see what he was up to these days. And the vitriol that I found in the comments on some of his recent posts was quite alarming. And most of these vengeful, hateful comments were coming from Christians. Now, it's worth noting that Driscoll or someone on his team have since started removing these negative comments from his social media accounts. Is it a desperate attempt to clean up his public image? Is it a way for Driscoll to set boundaries on his own social feeds? Make of that what you will. But what was even more alarming than all of that is the vitriol that I started feeling in my own heart as I listened to episode after episode and heard the countless heartbreaking stories of Mark's victims. I'm ashamed to say I started feeling hatred in my own heart towards Mark. My strong warning to you, if you listen to this podcast, is to guard your heart. As you listen to the story, remember that Mark Driscoll is a human being made in God's image. Mark is our brother in Christ. Should he be held responsible for his actions? I think so. Is he qualified to be in ministry? Probably not. Is he any less deserving of God's love and grace than you or me? Absolutely not. Our response to this podcast should not be hatred or anger, but grief. We should grieve for Mark's victims, the told and untold lives decimated in the destruction of Mars Hill Church. But we should also grieve for Mark. We should pray for Mark. And above all, we should believe that God is at work in broken places, not least being Mark Driscoll's heart.
Every moment you're reminded that my past does not define me. This brand new heart is finally finding grace upon grace.